Imagine standing in a frozen forest where the temperature has plummeted to -40 degrees, and the very air you breathe feels like shattered glass. Behind the tree line, an army of 500,000 men and thousands of tanks approaches, certain that your small nation will fall within days. But as the silence of the snow settles, the invaders realize they are marching into a conquest. They are walking into a meat grinder designed by a people who have nowhere left to retreat. The impossible ultimatum. How does a nation of less than 4 million people look at a superpower and simply say no? To understand the frozen carnage of the Winter War, we have to go back to the autumn of 1939, when the world was already watching the maps of Europe bleed. While Hitler's war machines were tearing through Poland, Joseph Stalin was looking at his own borders with a growing sense of cold, calculated paranoia. He looked at the city of Leningrad, the jewel of the Soviet Union, and saw a vulnerability. The Finnish border sat a mere 20 miles away, a distance an invading army could cover in a single morning. Stalin didn't just want a buffer, he wanted a surrender of sovereignty. In the gilded halls of the Kremlin, Soviet diplomats issued a series of demands that felt less like a negotiation and more like an execution order. They demanded the Finns move their border back, cede strategic islands in the Gulf of Finland, and hand over the Rybachi Peninsula. In exchange, a piece of desolate Soviet Karelia that no one wanted was a trade of vital defensive heartlands for empty wilderness. Have you ever wondered what goes through the minds of a small council of leaders when they realize that saying yes means losing their soul, but saying no means certain war? The Finns knew they were outgunned. They knew their air force was virtually non-existent, and their tanks were museum pieces. Yet, they refused. They chose a path of defiance that most of the world viewed as a suicide pact. As the final negotiations collapsed in late November, the Soviet Union didn't just prepare for a campaign, they prepared for a parade. They were so confident in their overwhelming weight of numbers that they brought brass bands and formal dress uniforms for the victory celebration in Helsinki. But as the first Soviet shells began to fall on the morning of November 30th, 1939, a strange phenomenon occurred across Finland. Political rivals who had spent years at each other's throats suddenly stood shoulder to shoulder. The spirit of the Winter War was born in that moment, a collective realization that if they were going to die, they would make the cost of their soil so high that the bear would choke on it. The invaders expected a quick, surgical strike against a fractured people. Instead, they were about to step into a landscape where the terrain itself was a weapon, and the silence of the woods held 1,000 hidden eyes. Do you think a nation can ever truly be conquered if its people refuse to accept the reality of their own defeat? The Red Mirage. Have you ever seen an army so blinded by its own reflection that it could unsee the trap it was walking into? As the Soviet 7th Army surged across the Karelian Isthmus, they didn't just bring soldiers, they brought a crushing sense of inevitability. From the Kremlin's perspective, the math was simple. They had 4 times the population, 30 times the aircraft, and 100 times the tanks. On paper, Finland wasn't a combatant, it was a speed bump. This was the Red Mirage, the illusion that sheer mass could compensate for a total lack of preparation and a fundamental misunderstanding of the human spirit. But as the columns of T-26 tanks rumbled forward, the Soviet commanders made a fatal mistake. They assumed the Finns would fight a conventional war. They expected a front line that would buckle under a massive artillery barrage. Instead, they found a ghost landscape. The Finns had scorched the earth, burning their own homes and barns to deny the invaders warmth, and retreated into the shadows. The Red Army, largely composed of conscripts from the warm southern plains of the USSR, found themselves trapped on narrow, bottlenecked roads, surrounded by deep snow and ancient forests they couldn't navigate. Think about the psychological toll of marching into a void. The Soviet soldiers were wearing thin olive-drab summer uniforms because the high command believed the war would be over before the real winter set in. As the sun began to set at 3 in the afternoon, the temperature plummeted and the mirage of a quick victory vanished. The Soviet steamroller was beginning to stall, not because of a wall of steel, but because of the friction of the land itself. Their equipment began to fail. Oil froze in the engines, and the bolt actions of their rifles jammed. While the Soviets struggled to keep their massive machinery moving, the Finns were moving on skis, gliding silently through the trees like predators in their natural habitat. They weren't just fighting for territory, they were fighting for time. The world watched in disbelief as reports began to filter out. The invincible Red Army was stuck, bleeding out in a wasteland they didn't understand. If your enemy has every machine of modern war, but you have the mastery of the environment, who truly holds the power? The red mirage was fading, and in its place, a cold, dark reality was beginning to set in for the men of the Soviet Union. Hell at the Mannerheim Line. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object built of grit and frozen earth? As the Soviet High Command grew frustrated with the lack of progress, they focused their immense fury on the Karelian Isthmus. Here lay the Mannerheim Line, not a wall of concrete like the Maginot Line, but a subtle, deadly web of trenches, granite boulders, and hidden machine gun nests woven into the natural ridges and swamps. To the Soviets, it was a hurdle to be flattened. To the Finns, it was the final shield protecting their families. Day after day, the horizon glowed a hellish orange as Soviet artillery unleashed a bombardment of terrifying proportions. Thousands of shells turned the pristine snow into a blackened, lunar landscape. When the fire stopped, the tanks moved in, followed by waves of infantry shouting battle cries. But the Finns didn't run. They waited until the Soviet columns were entangled in barbed wire and tank traps before opening fire. The slaughter was industrial. In some sectors, the piles of fallen Soviet soldiers grew so high that the Finns had to move the bodies just to clear a line of sight for their next volleys. Can you imagine the mental fortitude required to sit in a frozen trench while the world's largest army throws everything it has at you? The Finnish soldiers were often outnumbered 50-1 in these skirmishes. They lived on Sisu, a unique Finnish word that translates to a brand of stoic, white-knuckled courage that surfaces only when all hope seems lost. They weren't just holding a line, they were breaking the spirit of the Red Army. Behind the Soviet lines, the carnage created a crisis of command. Stalin's purges had recently wiped out his most experienced officers, leaving the army led by terrified men who cared more about following rigid orders than keeping their soldiers alive. They sent wave after wave of men into the same kill zones, repeating the same suicidal maneuvers. The Mannerheim Line became a symbol of Soviet humiliation. For the first time, the world began to ask, is it possible for a giant to be brought to its knees by a few thousand men who simply refused to blink? The hell at the Mannerheim Line proved that while steel can break, Sisu is unbreakable. The ghost in the White Forest. While the world's attention was fixed on the thunderous artillery of the Mannerheim Line, a different kind of war was being waged in the silent northern wilderness. It was a war of whispers, shadows, and the terrifying realization that death could come from 100 yards away without a sound. This was the domain of the Finnish marksmen, men who had spent their lives hunting in these woods and who now treated the invading army like the most dangerous game they had ever tracked. Among them was a man who would become a living nightmare for the Soviet rank and file, Simo Häyhä, the White Death. Imagine being a Soviet conscript, huddled around a fire for a scrap of warmth, knowing that to stand up or even to expose a sliver of skin was to invite a bullet. The Finns didn't use flashy equipment. He famously used iron sights rather than scopes, because glass could fog in the cold or catch the glint of the sun. Giving away his position, he would pack snow into his mouth to keep his breath from steaming in the frozen air. He was a ghost, invisible against the drifts, and he was not alone. Hundreds of Finnish snipers turned the forest into a psychological prison. But the fear wasn't just about the snipers. It was the mobility of the Finnish Sisu units. These were elite light infantry on skis, white-clad phantoms who could cover 50 miles of rugged terrain in a night. They would strike the Soviet supply lines, vanish into the trees, and reappear miles away before the confused survivors could even return fire. The Red Army, bound to the roads by their heavy trucks and tanks, could only watch the tree line with growing dread. Have you ever considered how much an army's morale depends on the belief that they can see their enemy? To the Soviets, the Finns weren't men anymore. They were spirits of the cold. This psychological warfare created a paralyzing tension. Every snap of a frozen branch, every rustle of wind through the pines, felt like a prelude to an ambush. The invaders were no longer fighting a war of conquests. They were fighting a war of survival against an enemy that seemed to be part of the landscape itself. The forest was no longer a place of cover. It was a graveyard waiting to be filled. If you cannot see your enemy, how do you even begin to fight back? The Motti, death by 1,000 cuts. What do you do when your enemy is a massive armored serpent stretching for miles along a single snow-choked road? You don't strike the head. You chop the body into pieces. As the Soviet divisions pushed deeper into the Finnish interior, they became victims of their own scale. This led to the birth of the Motti, a Finnish word for a cord of firewood. but in military terms, a recipe for total annihilation. The Finnish strategy was as elegant as it was brutal. Using their superior mobility on skis, they would strike the long, vulnerable Soviet columns at multiple points simultaneously. They would blow up a bridge at the front and block the path with felled trees at the rear. Suddenly, a division of 20,000 men was no longer a fighting force. It was a collection of isolated pockets, trapped in the deep snow and unable to support one another. These were the Mottis. Imagine being trapped in one of these pockets. You are surrounded by a wall of white forest you cannot enter. You have no food because the supply trucks are burning 10 miles down the road. You have no fuel for your tanks, which have become nothing more than steel coffins in the 40 below cold. The Finns didn't rush in to finish the job. They let the General Winter do the heavy lifting. They would pick off the officers and the field kitchens first, leaving the remaining soldiers to starve and freeze in the dark. By the time the Battle of Suomussalmi ended, 2 entire Soviet divisions had been erased from the map. The road was littered with thousands of frozen bodies and abandoned equipment, a sight so gruesome that even the battle-hardened Finnish scouts were shaken. It was the ultimate proof that mass and power mean nothing if you cannot feed your men or keep them warm. Have you ever realized that sometimes the greatest strength can become a fatal weakness if it is pinned down in an environment it was unbuilt to survive? The bear was being bled dry, one small cut at a time. The breaking point. How much pressure can a single nation withstand before the cracks become a chasm? By February 1940, the world was cheering for Finland, but the reality on the ground was becoming increasingly grim. Stalin, humiliated by the early disasters and the global laughter at his expense, did what the Soviet Union did best. He leaned into the sheer, brutal weight of his resources. He replaced his incompetent generals with Semyon Timoshenko, a man who understood that if you couldn't outsmart the Finns, you would simply have to crush them under a mountain of shells and men. The Red Army reorganized. They brought in specialized cold-weather gear, improved their combined arms tactics, and concentrated a terrifying amount of firepower on the Karelian Isthmus. The bombardment that followed made the previous months look like a skirmish. At some points, the Soviets were firing 250,000 shells a day. The earth didn't just shake, it liquefied. The Finnish defenders, who had been fighting without relief for months, were reaching the end of their physical and emotional endurance. Can you picture the exhaustion of a soldier who has unslept in a warm bed for 90 days, whose ears are bleeding from constant explosions, and who is down to his last few rounds of ammunition? The Finns were running out of everything: bullets, bandages, and most importantly, men. There were no reserves left to call upon. Young boys and old men were being sent to the front to fill the gaps. Meanwhile, the Soviet tide just kept coming. For every division the Finns destroyed, 2 more appeared to take its place. The Mannerheim Line, once thought invincible, began to crumble. The Soviets finally breached the main defensive works at Suma, and the Finnish army was forced into a fighting retreat. The strategic situation was desperate. The Finnish government looked to the west of Britain and France for a miracle. But help was slow. Tangled in politics and geography, the choice was becoming agonizingly clear. Find a way to end the slaughter, or watch the entire nation be swallowed whole. If you were the leader of a people who had fought so perfectly, could you find the strength to tell them that the fight must end, not with victory, but with a signature on a surrender document? The breaking point wasn't just a military reality. It was a heartbreaking choice between survival and total extinction, a bitter peace and a lasting legacy. Is it possible to win a war but lose the peace? On March 12, 1940, the pens finally moved across the paper in Moscow, bringing a sudden, haunting silence to the Finnish forests. The terms were devastating. Finland was forced to cede 11% of its territory, including the city of Viipuri and the entirety of Lake Ladoga. Over 400,000 Finns, more than a tenth of the population, suddenly found themselves homeless, given only hours to pack what they could carry and trek into a diminished homeland. They had held the line, but they had lost the land. Yet, as the smoke cleared, the world looked at the map and saw something miraculous. Finland still existed, in an era where the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were swallowing sovereign nations whole. This tiny republic had maintained its independence. They had inflicted over 300,000 casualties on the Red Army, a ratio of loss so lopsided it remains one of the most lopsided conflicts in modern history. But the cost was etched into every Finnish family tree: 6,000 dead and 43,000 wounded. The spirit of the Winter War had saved the nation, but it had left a scar that would never fully heal. Think about the ripples this conflict sent through history. Adolf Hitler, watching from Berlin, saw the Red Army's early bungling and concluded that the Soviet Union was a rotting structure that would collapse with a single kick. This hubris would lead him to launch Operation Barbarossa, just a year later, a decision that would change the course of human history. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, stung by the humiliation, began a frantic modernization of its military, learning the hard lessons that would eventually allow them to defeat the Wehrmacht. What is the true measure of a victory? Is it the lines drawn on a map, or the survival of a culture that refused to be erased? The Winter War remains a testament to the fact that power is not merely a matter of numbers, but of resolve. The Finns proved that a people united by a common purpose and an unyielding Sisu can stare down a giant and live to tell the tale. As we look back at those 3 months of fire and ice, we are left with a question that echoes through every modern conflict. How much is your freedom worth when the world tells you that your cause is already lost? If this story of defiance against impossible odds moved you, hit the like button and subscribe to join us as we uncover the most incredible turning points in human history. The Winter War was defined by Sisu, that unique Finnish brand of courage. I want to hear from you in the comments. Is there a moment in history where you think sheer willpower mattered more than weapons? Let's get the discussion started below. If you want to dive deeper into the shadows of the Second World War, click the video on your screen now to explore another untold story of the front lines. Thank you for watching, and stay curious.